Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a topic that's just so relevant right now, isn't it? In our, globalized world, we're talking about the power of English language skills.
Absolutely. And you see governments, like take Indonesia, for example, really pushing English teaching, from middle school right up through university.
Exactly. And the goal seems clear, right? Boost the quality of human resources, make sure graduates can actually compete globally. Sounds straightforward.
It does sound straightforward.
But here's where it gets interesting, and maybe this resonates with you listening. Despite all this push, all the clear benefits, you sometimes see students in English classes who seem, well,
Less than thrilled.
yeah, maybe a bit unenthusiastic. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, what's really driving learners? Especially with languages.
What's the actual motivation there?
Right. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to explore, the core of learning motivation, specifically for undergrads learning English. We found this really fascinating study from Universitas Teknokrat Indonesia. It digs into the factors and honestly finds some surprising sub-factors influencing motivation.
Yeah, it's quite insightful.
So we want to uncover those dynamics and maybe help you understand what really gets language learners going. Let's get into it.
Great, because fundamentally motivation isn't just like a nice to have.
Yeah.
It's critical. It really impacts students' self-confidence, their whole attitude, their willingness to even engage.
Okay.
There's this assumption, and it generally holds true, that if you have a clear desire, a goal for learning English, you're probably going to be more successful.
Makes sense, like having a why.
Exactly. Without that spark, whether it's internal or an external push, learning can feel like just grinding away.
An uphill battle.
Yeah. And it's not just about the student's internal world. The teacher's ability, how they actually teach in the class, that hugely influences success, too. It's a two-way street.
Right, that dynamic between teacher and student. Okay, so how did this Indonesian study try to sort of untangle all that? What was their approach?
Well, they used a qualitative research method, so looking beyond just numbers. Their main tool was a pretty comprehensive questionnaire.
Okay.
And it wasn't just thrown together. It was based on some established frameworks for motivation, specifically Gardner's ATMB.
ATMB.
Yeah, it stands for the Attitude Motivation Test Battery. It's quite well known in language learning research. And they also used a motivation questionnaire developed by Suriatsa and colleagues. So solid grounding.
Very solid. Okay. And this questionnaire, what did it actually ask? What was it trying to measure?
It had 30 questions, quite detailed. They used a 5-point Likert scale.
Oh, the strongly agree to strongly disagree kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly that. And the questions were designed to tease out two main types of motivation. First, intrinsic motivation, the stuff that comes from inside, like you just enjoy it or you're curious.
Right. Learning for learning's sake.
Sort of, yeah. And second, extrinsic motivation that's driven by external things, rewards, grades, avoiding trouble, that sort of thing.
Got it. And who actually filled out these questionnaires? Who were the students?
So the sample was 30 undergraduate students, all from Universitas Teknokrat Indonesia.
Okay, 30 students.
Yeah, and they were smart about it. They split the group equally. 10 from sports education, 10 from mathematics education, and 10 from English education.
Oh, interesting mix. So not just language majors?
Right. It gives a broader perspective, helps see if the motivation patterns are similar across different fields.
Okay, makes sense. So they've got the frameworks, the questions, the diverse group of students. They gathered the data. What was the big takeaway, the core revelation?
Well, here's the twist, and it might challenge what a lot of us assume. For these particular students, extrinsic motivation actually came out slightly ahead.
Really? Ahead of intrinsic?
Yeah. The numbers were 39.66 for extrinsic versus 36.1 for intrinsic. Now, the study notes the distance wasn't too significant.
But extrinsic still edged it out. It was the main factor identified.
Precisely. Extrinsic motivation emerged as the primary driver for this group.
Wow. That's actually quite surprising. You often think intrinsic drive, that passion, is what really matters most long term.
Me too. And maybe it does long term, but perhaps for skills like English, which are seen as, essential for jobs and global stuff, maybe those immediate external factors, the rewards, the pressures, are a really powerful initial kickstart. Maybe they pave a way for intrinsic interest later.
That's a really interesting point. Okay, so if extrinsic led the charge, which specific types of extrinsic motivation were strongest? What stood out?
The study found that the factor of rewards and punishments was the most dominant extrinsic factor.
Rewards and punishments, okay. The classic parrot and stick.
Basically, yeah. And the mean score was 41.4, which was the highest among all factors intrinsic or extrinsic.
And the specific numbers are quite telling, aren't they?
They really are. Get this. 56%, over half, strongly agreed their motivation came from being afraid of punishment from the lecturer.
56%. Wow. That's a strong motivator, I guess, even if it's a negative one. Fear of failure or consequences.
It certainly highlights how immediate consequences can shape behavior. But it wasn't all negative pressure. On the flip side, 60% agreed that gifts, rewards from lecturers and parents were also their motivation.
Okay, so the positive reinforcement worked too. 60% for gift.
Yeah, it really shows that double-edged sword, doesn't it? Rewards and punishments both seem effective in driving action for these students.
Definitely food for thought there about how those levers work.
Okay.
Okay, what was the second most dominant extrinsic factor?
That was the quality of lectures and the teaching process. It scored high, too, around 40.0.
Ah, the teacher effect.
Exactly. This covers everything from, like, the lecture's own enthusiasm, their teaching methods, the strategies they use, the whole classroom experience they create.
And you mentioned the human element earlier. This seems to back that up strongly. Did the data show students felt their teachers were doing a good job?
It did. A really significant number. 80%, that's 24 out of 30 students, agreed their English teacher presented the materials in an interesting way.
80%. That's huge. It really underlines how much difference a good, engaging teacher makes. It's not just about the subject matter itself.
Absolutely critical. Then the third extrinsic factor they looked at was learning support facilities.
Okay, what does that cover? The physical environment.
Yeah, things like comfortable classrooms, the general campus vibe, having study partners, but also, importantly, the learning media and applications used.
Tech tools, resources.
Right. And this factor had a mean score of 35.9. And interestingly, the data here links back to the teacher quality point as well. A very high 82% agree their English teacher had a dynamic and interesting teaching style that specifically used engaging media or applications.
82%. So students really respond to teachers who use technology and varied methods effectively. It's not just the teacher or the tools, but how they work together.
Precisely. It shows the importance of a supportive, well-resourced, and engaging learning environment overall.
Okay, so that covers the dominant extrinsic factors. But let's not forget intrinsic motivation. Even if it wasn't number one overall, it's still there. What did they find about the internal drivers?
Right, it definitely still played a role. For initial motivation to learn, the score was 35.6, so respectable. And a key finding here was that 80% of students agreed with this statement. Learning English has made me more able to understand the world.
Ah, that's interesting.
Yeah, through reading, news, media, films, that kind of thing.
So that connects to a broader curiosity, right? A desire for knowledge, for global understanding. That feels quite intrinsic.
It does. It shows many students do have that internal drive to broaden their horizons, even if other factors rank slightly higher overall in this study.
Okay. And what about the other intrinsic factor, future goals? How did that play out?
Future goals actually scored a bit higher within the intrinsic category at 36.6.
Higher than the initial motivation.
Okay. And this is where we see a very practical, strong motivator. A significant 76% agreed that studying English is important because I will need it for my career.
76%. That's a big chunk, seeing English as directly linked to their future job prospect.
Very career-driven, yeah. It shows a clear understanding, or belief at least, that English is a tool for professional success. It bridges intrinsic goals with, arguably, extrinsic outcomes like getting a good job.
It does blur the lines a bit, doesn't it? But it's definitely a powerful motivator, though you mentioned a nuance.
Yeah, just a small point, but worth noting. 2% actually disagreed that English mastery would help their careers.
2%. Tiny, but a reminder that not everyone sees it the same way, or maybe they have very specific career paths in mind where they think it won't matter.
Exactly. Motivations aren't universal, even for something like English.
Okay, so we've unpacked the extrinsic factors, rewards, punishments, teacher quality, facilities, and the intrinsic ones, initial interest, future goals. If we pull all these fascinating threads together, what's the big picture message from this study?
Well, connecting it all, the main conclusion for this specific group of undergrads in Indonesia is pretty clear. While yes, both types of motivation are definitely there, extrinsic factors, especially those immediate ones like rewards, punishments, and how good the lecturer is perceived to be, seem to have the most significant impact on their drive to learn English.
So the external environment and interactions really mattered, perhaps more than just assuming students would be self-motivated from the get-go.
That's what the data suggests for this context. It implies that actively shaping that external learning environment can be a really powerful catalyst.
Which leads to some pretty direct, practical thoughts for educators, right?
Absolutely. The study basically suggested if you want to boost language learning motivation, you should probably focus strategically on a couple of things. One, using appropriate rewards, and yes, maybe even consequences thoughtfully. And two, perhaps even more importantly, consistently working on improving teaching quality.
Making classes engaging, using those tools effectively.
Exactly. It's about optimizing that external setup to maybe ignite the spark, or at least sustain it, rather than just hoping students arrive with all the internal motivation they need.
This really brings up a question for you listening in. How do these findings about external drivers, about teacher impact, how do they sit with your own understanding of motivation? Whether you're a student, a teacher, maybe a manager, or just, curious about how learning works, does this make you rethink what pushes people?
Yeah, think about that tangible power of external factors and the immediate impact of a really good teacher, or maybe a not so good one. Sometimes, this study suggests, those things can actually outweigh the internal drives, at least initially.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought to chew on. If rewards, consequences, teacher quality are so impactful for learning English, as the study found, how might that apply elsewhere? Think about other skills you've learned or maybe things you want to learn. Does this research change how you think about what really pushes you or the people around you to learn something new?
It's definitely something worth pondering, isn't it? What truly fuels that drive to learn and grow?